Einstein, Mozart, put them all
Yeah.
together. They couldn't rival Adam
Yeah.
and Eve because they had unhindered, a sinless context
Yeah.
with the one who created them.
Jesus walked in the garden with them.
So there's no doubt they were brilliant.
Yeah.
These weren't knuckle-dragging people
Right.
that had to figure out how to make fire.
Right. This is Ask Dr. E, where Dr. Michael Easley answers your biblical or theological questions in 10 minutes or less, or like lately it's been more like 15, but we're going to do our best.
That was just one, wasn't it?
I don't know. Here's the question of the week. Was the Garden of Eden really perfect? Air quotes here. I read this in some Bible study notes recently. When the first man and woman disobeyed God, sin disrupted God's perfect creation. But was it perfect? Satan was in the garden. How can that be perfect? I like this.
It's always fun to hypothesize about the Garden of Eden, right?
We do get a lot of Garden of Eden questions, don't we?
Maybe it's because we want to go back to
I do.
Eden.
And I think we think we're going back to the garden. Yeah. And as I've been studying Revelation, which I talked about in a prior episode, it's like, we're not going back, guys. The point is not the garden. Anyway.
A new heavens and a new earth.
Yeah.
Well, interesting. You can find a lot of speculation about the garden. And, I did a survey of some things I won't share because it's a waste of time. But there's a lot of fanciful stuff. And I think there's some underwhelming things too. So as always, I want to go back to what the text does tell
Please,
us,
thank you.
not just a speculation.
Yes.
So this context was before sin. It's God designing an environment for this sinless context for Adam and later the woman.
Can we say there wasn't sin if Satan existed? Is it not sin that he, as an angel, defied God?
If we get into angelic realms of those who fell and the timing of all this sequence, and obviously Satan is going to take over the talking serpent role for a time being. Yes, but they fell against God. Their angelic realm is not like man's sin. It's hubris. They're spiritual creatures. I mean, this gets into angelology pretty deep. Yeah. And I would say it's not sin in the same way because there's no solution for their sin.
Satan's
There's no efficacious work. Yeah, you're one and done. So because they are supernatural creatures with unique abilities and knowledge, in some ways they're more brilliant than man. In other ways they're not. So we're getting way off in the weeds. But for the context of the garden, there was abundant provision. From any tree of the garden you may eat freely. There was unhindered worship in the cool of the evening. Christ, I would argue, came in his form, we call it a Christophany or a theophany. He came and talked to them in the cool of the day. There's no shame.
Yeah.
And in the wedding passage, which we talked about in another episode, naked and not ashamed is huge, because think of any person with any body image going forward, there's shame. Any person. We're too fat, we're too tall, we're too skinny, we're too wide, our hips are too big, too thin, our legs, our knees. There's something we don't like about ourselves, and we're ashamed of that feature. Why do people have so much work done? There's no shame. So if we just stop on those three, unbelievable provision, unhindered access to worship, and no shame. Eden is a context.
Yes.
It was not necessarily to be this multiplied environment that the whole world would enjoy, right? Say it simply, unfallen creatures in an unfallen context.
Okay.
After the sin, and we can talk about the serpent if you want, but after the real juxtaposition with the serpent is not the serpent's action. What God has said, I've given you everything but one prohibition. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the question becomes, I've given you unhindered access to me. I've given you more than enough provision. I've given you a shameless existence. Will you trust me? That's the crux. And so the temptation from the serpent is, has God said, or in the sense of you want to be like God, knowing good and evil. Half truth is always a whole lie. In this case, of course, it was their downfall. So the test was, do you trust the one who gave you all these provisions, who gives you everything, who fellowships with you unhindered? And oh, by the way, this cultivate and keep is not trimming the hedges and pulling weeds.
Right.
It's an act of worship. It
Yeah.
was a work we can't understand, but if you think of a beautiful spring day where you don't break a sweat and you love working in the ground and you plant some flowers and you enjoy it and say, isn't God's creation amazing?
Yeah.
That would be an illustration of cultivate and keep.
Yeah.
It's an act of worshiping this environment God gave him, unfallen context,
Yeah.
unfallen creatures. You going to trust me? And of course, no.
Yeah. And something I read recently was, will you be satisfied with what I've given you? Will you be grateful and content with what I've given you?
Or the one thing you can't.
And Satan goes, but there's more.
Yep.
But there's more.
You could be like him.
I mean, that really, because I always think of, it was the sin of pride. They wanted to be God.
100%.
They wanted to be like God. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I mean, it's all together, right? But it's like, oh, it's ingratitude. It's saying, God, what you've given me, not enough. I mean, I think we say that. We say both every day.
All the time.
I want to be God. This isn't enough. I want more. And it's like, God,
How we try to control
how have we
things.
not learned?
Yeah. But also, don't forget, and I truly believe Adam and Eve were the two most brilliant people on the planet.
I know you believe that. I mean, I believe with you.
Jesus would be the second Adam, of course, but
Yes.
Einstein, Mozart, put them all
Yeah.
together. They couldn't rival Adam and
Yeah.
Eve because they had unhindered, a sinless context
Yeah.
with the one who created them.
Jesus walked in the garden with them.
So there's no doubt they were brilliant.
Yeah.
These weren't knuckle-dragging people
Right.
that had to figure out how to make fire.
Right.
I mean,
a
these
wheel.
were brilliant people.
Yeah.
So have a little deference to who they are. Sin shattered the relationship. Sin destroyed that fellowship.
Yeah.
Sin makes the curse of the ground. The serpent, of course, is cursed for his infiltrating and tempting them, which is a whole nother angelology story. But the point of Eden was not to live there forever. The point of Eden was, will you trust God at his word?
Mm.
That was the point. And you're exactly right. It was pride. I want to be like God. Okay, you'll be like God. You can
You'll
go
know
with your
evil
pride, and
and
you're going to know
brokenness
evil,
and
and you're going to know the
death.
consequences of it. So I don't think, again, language it's so complex, and we think of a perfect environment or a perfect day
yeah.
or a perfect
Yeah.
meal, which is a little funny, but I don't think that was the point of Eden. Sure, we'd like to go back to Eden,
Yeah.
but problem is we'd all sin.
Yeah.
And apart from the efficacious work of Christ and understanding our relationship going forward, and then in our resurrection, being free from this sinful body, we would always be in that loop. So I would argue the new heavens and new earth are going to be better than Eden.
100%.
A lot better than Eden.
Well, Satan's not going to be there.
No temptation. And we won't have the ability to sin
Right.
and break that relationship again. It'll be unhindered access to the throne of grace.
And we've done a whole episode on that. You answered a question about basically how can we know we're not going to just repeat the same thing and just someone's going to pull a Adam and Eve, and so we'll link that episode in the show notes because
Like a Twilight Zone.
it really is. I mean, it's like, that would be awful.
Groundhog Day, spiritual Groundhog Day. You
gosh.
can never get out of it.
Gosh, yikes. Okay. Well, anything else that
No,
I
think
interrupted
I've-
you?
I
Did you
think
get to finish or?
I've beaten the dead lamb enough.
All right. If you've got a question for Dr. E, call us, text us, email us. The info is in your show notes.